Welcome, everybody. I'm Sophie Volk, the chair of Center for Chinese Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome our three panelists today. William Kirby is T.M. Zhang Professor of China Studies at Harvard University and Spangler Family Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. He is a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor and serves as chairman of the Harvard China Fund, as well as faculty chair of the Harvard Center Shanghai. A historian of modern China, Kirby's work examines contemporary China's business, economic, and political development in an international context. Orville Schell is the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at Asia Society in New York and former dean at Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. He worked for the Ford Foundation in Indonesia, covered the war in Indochina as a journalist, and has traveled widely in China since the mid-1970s. Schell is the author of 15 books, 10 of them about China, including My Old Home, a novel of exile. He's written widely for many magazines and newspapers, including the Atlantic Monthly, the New Yorker, and the Los Angeles Times. Schell is a fellow at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University, a senior fellow at the Annenberg School of Communications at USC, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also the recipient of many prizes and fellowships, including a Guggenheim Fellowship. And finally, John Pomfret is an award-winning writer and former foreign correspondent and editor at the Washington Post. He's the author of The Beautiful Country and the Middle Kingdom, America and China, 1776 to the Present, Chinese Lessons, 5 Classmates in the Story of the New China, and From Warsaw with Love, Polish Spies, the CIA, and the Making of an Unlikely Alliance. Pomfret was awarded the Osborne Elliott Prize for Journalism in Asia by the Asia Society in 2003, and the Shorenstein Award by Harvard and Stanford Universities for his lifetime coverage of Asia. So welcome, everybody. So our first speaker is Bill Kirby, right? And then we'll hear from Orville Schell, and lastly from John. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We're here to talk about the triangular relationship between China, the United States, and Taiwan. And I thought I would talk more about, and initially about Taiwan, which tends, until very recently, not to get quite the same level of attention. The other is it's a bit of the fulcrum, oftentimes, of U.S.-China relations. And I remember when I first went to Taiwan, I think Tom Gold had been there before. We both had Fulbrights in the same year. And I was called in right before going to Taiwan. I was called in by the director of placement at Harvard, of graduate or undergraduate, graduate placement, the guy who's in charge of career services, to meet with him. And I thought, what a nice idea. He knows there are no jobs in China studies. He's trying to get me a good job after I get through this research. And he says, while you're in Taiwan, would you mind doing a little bit of work for a certain agency? This is at a moment, 1978, when the American troops are going home. And I said to him, well, I wasn't a big fan of the CIA at that point in time in any event. I declined by saying that the last time I looked, Taiwan was an island, and I was not a very good swimmer. And they have a very good police force. And thank you for the opportunity, but I didn't take it. I'm just going to give you a little bit of something that you all in this room probably know reasonably well, but some commentary on the kind of trajectory of Taiwan's modern development. A place, of course, of Aboriginal settlement, settled mostly then thereafter by Chinese from Fujian and other coastal provinces. A place that, of course, becomes under Japanese control in 1895, having been a province of the Qing only for 10 years before that period of time. A place that becomes industrialized and modernized, largely initially under Japanese authority. A place that builds a beautiful presidential palace, although then the Governor General's palace, still there today, serving the ROC, and a place that is welcoming. Here are the elites of Taiwan welcoming the Japanese, and 50 years later, welcoming the nationalists. A more welcoming people is difficult to imagine. Not always happily received, however, on one side. And of course, it becomes the home of so-called free China. The portraits of Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, ubiquitous in the height of the Cold War. It is an ally of the United States, a 30-year alliance or an alliance of 1954 that would be terminated in 1979, a place that looked to be the bastion of national recovery, a place that communicated mostly militarily with the mainland and the great struggles over Jinmen and Matsu that became central to American politics. Some in this room will remember during the Nixon-Kennedy debates of 1960, a place, rather rudimentary forms of communication across the strait in those days, here from Jinmen to Xiamen, and other forms of communication. And a place of Sino-American friendship. I used to have when I used to give examinations to my students. I've decided I don't do that anymore because it's so disappointing. But I would one of the IDs I would give was the Sino-American Treaty of got the precise name of mutual defense, Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty. Which is, of course, that between the United States and the Republic of China. And almost no student can identify that out. Here is Vice President Nixon giving Chiang Kai-shek what he's always wanted, a picture of President Eisenhower, who then very shortly visits himself, seemingly not particularly pleased in this one. The only time an American president has visited the Republic of China on Taiwan. And yet, of course, as we know, presidents went elsewhere after a period of time, ending the rather special relationship, or as Taiwan as the ROC is the government of all China, beginning the normalization process here in 1972. Sorry, again, go back to that. And each president, I won't show them all, of course, has met with senior Chinese leaders. Here's Zhao Ziyan and President Reagan and the late Jiang Zemin, very sadly passed away just 2 days ago, with President Clinton right up to the current day. So the American side had seemingly sided with one side, leaned to one side, one might say, while maintaining the autonomy of Taiwan. And yet what has distinguished Taiwan throughout all this period is its own indigenous success. Here in land reform, a successful land reform, while that on the mainland failed catastrophically. Here, a great leap outward toward an export-oriented economy at a time that the mainland was pursuing a great leap forward catastrophically. Series of leaders first moving from a kind of a generational and really almost monarchical succession to Zhang Jingluo, to the first Taiwan-born president of the Republic of China, Li Denghui, to Chen Shui-bian, and having set in store finally the promise of 1927, when the Republic of China is reestablished as the Kuomintang, to have 7 years of tutelage and then democracy. Well, they had 70 years of tutelage, times being what they were, and finally a democratic system in which the Kuomintang here can lose power, but then it can regain power as well, and move toward, in a brief period of time under Ma Ying-jeou, toward a normalization without unification. In what seemed just a few years ago to be the direction of the times. Those times didn't continue, as we all know, although the presidential succession, the democratic traditions of Taiwan now seemingly well established with the return of the DPP under President Tsai Ing-wen here, still swearing allegiance to Sun Yat-sen, to the Republic of China, still singing the Guoge, which is, of course, a nationalist hymn. Well, it's not by accident that President Trump, when he's first president, decides, I'm going to call the president of China. And the Rolodex being a little bit off, ends up calling Tsai Ing-wen. But here's an example, and we can talk about this later, of American, this whole thing is being set up in part by those who want to support Taiwan. But this form of support of Taiwan does not automatically, at least in my view, make Taiwan more secure, nor does the visit of this Congresswoman, in my view, make Taiwan more secure. Rather significantly, less so, but Taiwan is in a position probably not to refuse the happy, if somewhat dangerous embrace of American politicians. But where Taiwan is today is at the fulcrum, not just of US-China relations, the irredentism of Xi Jinping and others to reclaim this last part of the old Qing Empire that they as yet don't control, although it wasn't part of the Qing when the Qing fell. And one would think that if one really had that as one's mission, one would start with Mongolia. But Taiwan is also home here. Here's Taiwan with Morris Chang, the founder and no longer president, but retired president of TSMC, perhaps maybe without question, the best technology company in the world. A man of whom I will just anecdotally remind you was a Harvard freshman. And he wanted to be an English major at Harvard. He still loves English literature. Whenever I meet him, and I've known him now for 30 years, I give him a novel. But when he told his father he wanted to be an English major at Harvard, his father forced him to transfer to MIT to get a real education. And he did, and he's done remarkably well. But Taiwan is now home, of course, to the greatest technology company and the greatest semiconductor company in the world. And will the American embrace of this, or the recruitment of TSMC to Arizona in northern Phoenix here, be good or bad for the prospects for Taiwan, but either economically or politically? On that, I have some significant doubts, but we'll leave that for a more open discussion. We'll just end with this last slide, which should remind us that at the end of the day, Taiwan is physically actually quite closer to mainland China than it is to the United States. And we're at a moment in time when that isn't obvious, at least to some members of Congress. I will stop there.
Well, that was a nice little sort of reprise of Taiwan's history. Let me start with Taiwan and then maybe make a few remarks about what's going on in China now and how that's influencing what will happen between us, China, and Taiwan. To see these photos, I mean, I first arrived in Taiwan in 1961 as a young student, and I remember going out to a beach across the Taiwan Straits at night just to listen to the radio broadcast crackling in from the mainland because it was so exciting. And there was a profound sense of something really tectonic and important happening across the Straits, where at that point, Taiwan was rather sleepy and a kind of a backwater, but an American ally. And but the state of antagonism between Taiwan and China was real. And in those days, I remember also riding my bicycle down to the presidential palace that you saw a photo of. And at the invitation of I think it was the Qingnian Zhouguo Tuan, the Youth Save the Nation Youth League, I would have tea with Chiang Kai-shek. And there weren't very many foreign students there then. I was back in Taiwan again about a month and a half, 2 months ago, and it was rather a haunting experience to be back in this island that, since I had been there as a young man, had become incredibly successful, very democratic, an extremely well-run place, and yet back in a state of complete antagonism with the mainland after this interim where, as Bill has suggested, under President Ma Ying-jeou, there was this period of years where it was very hopeful that things could be resolved. And so the question, I think, that everyone is asking is, what happened? Why did the whole thing come a cropper? And I think here is where we need to segue off to Xi Jinping and China, because I do think it was the advent of Xi Jinping the notion of China having gained wealth and power, and its claim, territorial claim, which is insoluble and incontrovertible, that Taiwan is part of China, and China's going to get Taiwan one way or another, as Xi Jinping said, sooner rather than later. So that transforms everything. And here we are, after all of these years, after Nixon and Kissinger and 9 US presidential administrations all supporting engagement, we're back at a state of antagonism. And I will just remind you of how strenuously the United States sought to maintain engagement and to demonstrate to China, even though we had different political systems, on and on and on, that it was something that the United States was supporting. After 1989, the Beijing massacre, you will remember that Bush the elder sent his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, to China secretly, did not even tell the American ambassador. I recently had a look at the transcript of that meeting. It was a stunning evocation of American effort to keep the relationship alive, to keep engagement functional. And Scowcroft kept saying to Deng Xiaoping, President Bush is your friend. Let's not break off the relationship. And Deng Xiaoping kept saying to Brent Scowcroft, you did this, you caused this demonstration, you're responsible, and kept eschewing him. And yet, things did go on. Engagement did continue. And I think the great tragedy of this new century in which we find ourselves is that engagement has ended irrevocably. And it has profoundly impacted what's going to happen in Taiwan. And I think it ended precisely because Xi Jinping had this notion that once China had attained sufficient power, it didn't need to bend, to compromise, to engage in diplomacy in any way. It could have its way. And we've seen that again and again and again, whether it's the Senkaku Islands with Japan, the South China Sea, Hong Kong. And this, it seems to me, presents not only the United States and Taiwan, but indeed the whole world with the potential tragedy of monstrous proportions. And the tragedy is this, that China, which when I first visited in 1975, when Mao Zedong was still alive and the Cultural Revolution still was in its waning phases, but still quite alive, since that time, we've come a kind of a complete full circle. China that had accomplished such an immense feat of national development and having catalyzed this country that was once the sick man of Asia, remember that, the Yazhou the Bing, back into a state where it was a great power. This now is all in balance. This is all threatened. With decoupling, with myriad other problems that China is having, having alienated countries that were once the most accommodating countries in the world, like Canada. Who alienates Canada? Sweden, Norway, Australia, India, the first country to recognize China in the 1950s. The tragedy is that China is decoupling itself from the world at the very time that it's reached its apogee of attainment. And it has so much to be proud of and so much to be that its people should be able to enjoy. Instead, it has thrown it back into a state of antagonism with the world. But of course, above all, the state of tension is greatest with Taiwan. And is the reunification of the motherland worth throwing away 100 years of hard work and development on the China mainland, it seems like a preposterous assessment of national security to say yes to that question. And thus, we see this triangle, which is the subject of why we're here tonight, enmeshed in all kinds of other very complicated considerations. But I think at the heart of all of it lies Xi Jinping and his new notion of what it means for China to have become a great power. And here, I think I'll end simply by saying that what I think we see happening now in China, I don't know, I can't predict. We've never predicted anything very well in China, those of us who studied China. But when Czeslaw Miłosz, who taught here at Berkeley and won the Nobel Prize of Literature, he said in his speech, and I paraphrase here, he said, in a society that is ruled by silence, a single person speaking the truth sounds like a gunshot. And I think that's what we're experiencing now in China, that a few people pushed to the limit by COVID policies have actually spoken out in ways which everybody thought was unthinkable and impossible. But they have uttered those few words, not a lot of them, but even one person does sound like a gunshot in such a silent room. And that, it seems to me, I don't know where it will lead. I don't think the Tiananmen Square is going to fill with protesters when they celebrate, memorialized Jiang Zemin on Tuesday, as they did when they memorialized Hu Yaobang in 1989. But it's a reminder that, everything is up in the air now. And this will, of course, have a profound impact on what China does in regard to Taiwan. And it would be a great shame, it seems to me, if China were actually to throw away its 100 years of development and the, quote, China miracle, simply to grab Taiwan back into the embrace of the Chinese Communist Party, when that is less than 2% of the people of Taiwan want that fate. So this is a rather dark and gloomy, I suppose, analysis of what's going on, but I think we are at a very stressful and very fraught time. And Taiwan was at the middle of this a week or two ago. It's sort of been pushed to the side, but it will return again, because that is the place, that is Asia's Ukraine. And we all know what happened when Putin went into the Ukraine. Let me stop here.
I should have come with a few jokes to lighten up the mood a little bit. But thank you, Orville and Bill, for those really interesting remarks. I wanted to push a little further on Xi Jinping. And I'm going to inflict a paragraph of a speech he gave in 2013, just a couple of months after he became the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. The interesting thing was this speech was released in Shoushi, as a magazine of the Central Committee, in January of 2019, about around the same time that Xi Jinping went to Davos and gave his speech extolling the virtues of globalization. And the Davos speech and this speech are really interesting to compare, because it shows you how external-facing Chinese officials will say one thing, whereas internally, they often use Chinese as sort of the first layer of encryption. They'll say another thing to their people. And this is from one of the first paragraphs of the speech by Xi Jinping. Facts have repeatedly told us that the analysis of the basic contradictions of capitalist society by Marx and Engels is not out of date, nor is the view of historical materialism on the inevitable demise of capitalism and the inevitable victory of socialism. This is an irreversible general trend of social and historical development, but the road is tortuous. For quite a long time, for quite a long period of time, socialism at the primary stage, which is China, must still cooperate and struggle with capitalism and its most developed productive forces. this idea of struggle runs like a river through most of Xi Jinping's internal speeches. And if you look at what's happening now with U.S.-China relations, you can kind of put that into context of his worldview. So currently, China is facing significantly high unemployment. Its economy is probably not growing. It's got a serious problem with zero COVID, which it's kind of trying to walk back. It has a population specifically above the age of 80 that doesn't have a very high vaccination rate. It's dealing with a lot of struggle, a lot of problems. And so if looking at US-China relations, you can kind of understand now why the Chinese are being relatively nice to America. There was conversations with Joe Biden, there was a meeting with Joe Biden, et cetera. Obviously, they're in a situation where struggling doesn't make sense at the current moment, but cooperation does because they need the United States. And so as a result, as to your point, several weeks ago, Taiwan was on the front burner. Now suddenly Taiwan is on the back burner. Again, because the Chinese don't really see this as an appropriate moment to struggle because they need to cooperate, because they need America's support. They want to try to the extent that they can, begin to pull away some of the decoupling that's been pushed by the United States. They're playing nice, in other words. Interesting. I think that Orville's point about what's the demonstrations happening in China right now are fascinating because sort of requoting Czesław Miłosz, it sounds like a thunderclap when people are actually pushing back against the PRC. But it's very interesting the policies that Xi Jinping and his minions have taken in reference to the protest. Again, cooperation and struggle. On one hand, you see, just in the last couple of days, the significant dismantling of zero COVID policies. In fact, zero COVID has not been mentioned by a senior Chinese official in several days now, except for Zhao Lijian, who kind of made a mistake as the foreign affairs spokesman, when for 45 seconds, he literally didn't say anything at the podium until he finally said, oh, we're supporting zero COVID. But for the last couple of days now, in several speeches from the National Health Commission, and also from Sun Chunlan, who's the COVID czar, she didn't mention zero COVID. So they've begun to dismantle some of the zero COVID policy. At the same time, they're beginning to crack down. There have been arrests of protesters. The Politics and Law Committee, which is the most significant political judicial structure in the parties, have had a meeting vowing to crack down against hostile forces, which means sort of Americans and their ideas and Chinese dissidents. The Cyberspace Administration has introduced new rules starting on December 15th that if you like a post that's considered inappropriate, you could suffer the consequences. Cyberspace authorities have also begun to squeeze Tencent and other social media platforms to remove posts. And owners of Huawei telephones have started to report that their own videos and other photographs of demonstrations have begun literally to disappear from their phones. And so cooperation on one side by dismantling some of the architecture of zero COVID versus struggling on the other side by rolling up protesters and squeezing and locking down. I think from my perspective, that speech has really been sort of set a great moment of light to me in trying to understand where Xi Jinping is taking his country, not simply in terms of his domestic policy, but also in terms of his policy towards the United States and then to Taiwan. Well, so thank you very much, and we look forward to your question.
None of us would disagree that this is a really dangerous moment globally, U.S.-China relations, Taiwan in between. You know, one of the remarkable things about, I had some friends who were in the neighborhood of Uluwuchilu, watching the sign of their own street being taken away the other day. But to have people say, you know, 共产党下台, Xi Jinping 下台, that was never said on April 5th, 1976 about Mao Zedong. It was then down with Qin Shi Huang. But no one dared say Mao Zedong. 1989, I don't believe anyone called directly for Deng Xiaoping's fall, but I may be.
Oh, I think
you may
think there were a few.
Okay, all right. They're all right.
The broken glass as well.
Yeah.
Oh, of course. There was that. You're quite right. But it is that voice in the wilderness that is suddenly heard, and it is a remarkable moment. And whether, you know, what it does tell you, among everything else, is that the political tinder, just months after the party Congress, is very, very dry. and not just in the general population, I would expect. But what question I would have for John, and to think about it, and both of you have that place this direction of China so directly and firmly on the one man, on Xi Jinping. And that may well be true, as we have certainly seen the possibility of powerful leaders determining the fates of nations, and in China in particular. And one of the things to worry about, from building on what John was saying about Xi Jinping's belief in a Marxist future, there's a line in some of the memoranda coming with the 20th Party Congress that Chinese-style socialism would lead to a new form of human civilization. It's a remarkable phrase. I haven't heard that since the Cultural Revolution, at least coming directly. But here's the question that I would have. Xi Jinping studied chemical engineering at Tsinghua University when there was no chemical engineering at Tsinghua University. So he did have a political education by and large, but he almost surely, we are not talking about a man who has spent a lot of time reading Marx and Marxism. So how, and almost surely he didn't write that speech. How do we determine, in fact, what group of people are determining the ideological direction that is very clearly consistent over the course of his rule and very inconsistent with the pronouncements at international gatherings like Davos? Do you have a sense of that, please?
If I did, I probably wouldn't be here. I mean, it's a great question, and I don't really have an easy answer to it. I think the thing that's, to me, it's really extraordinary is how, in looking at the 20th Party Congress, how well he dominated that narrative, and how there are no officials in the top leadership that represent any alternative to that view, and how he, in public view of everybody, basically defenestrated his predecessor by ushering him literally off the stage of history, regardless of what was said, et cetera. I mean, just the way it looked. And so that's something. And to your point, yeah, he's probably not an expert in Marxist-Leninist ideology. I think he is an expert in Stalinist ideology, and I think he has studied Stalin, and he praises Stalin, and he references Stalin's short course on communism on a regular basis. And I know he studied that, and I think he probably has gained a lot of inspiration from that.